The Correctional Services Department is expected to launch an investigation into an incident involving controversial businessman and suspected criminal Vusimuzi Matlala. He's been found in possession of a cell phone in his cell at the Kgosi Mampuru Correctional Centre in Pretoria. It was found during a raid on Sunday. Matlala has now been moved to a maximum security section at the centre. He's currently in prison facing charges of attempted murder for allegedly trying to kill his former girlfriend, actress Tebogo Thobejane, back in 2023. Matlala, who's recently been linked to Police Minister Senzo Mchunu, was also awarded a 360 million rand contract by the police, which was later cancelled following suspicions of possible wrongdoing. Let's speak more about this then with Sohela Surajpal, who's a legal researcher with the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. Good to have you with us as we want to talk this evening about the effectiveness of these sporadic raids. Hundreds, according to the Correctional Services Minister, conducted in just the last year. But when you look at what was found at Kgosi Mampuru in the last raid, so drugs, phones, marijuana, illegal electrical wiring, etc., it begs the question, how are these items smuggled into correctional centres like the cell phone in Matlala's case?
Thanks for having me. And it's a good and an important question, because one of the concerns that we at JIX have about these raids is whether they address the root causes of contraband. Of course, there are many ways contraband can get into prisons. When inmates who are awaiting trial go to court, they might return with smuggled contraband. Visitors might bring contraband into prisons, especially if they're not being properly searched. But really importantly, officials of the Department of Correctional Services are part of systems of corruption and probably bring in the vast majority of contraband into correctional services. These are complex, well-established, well-organized systems of corruption. We've heard allegations at JIX that when cell phones are confiscated in one cell, in one prison, those same cell phones or same contraband might reappear in another prison in a different part of the country, which would seem to imply that even the officials confiscating the contraband are involved in these complicated systems. We haven't completely verified those allegations, though.
But we know that in some of the cases, the correctional services staff themselves, the wardens, are involved. Who ultimately runs what you've said are complicated, complex rings, ultimately? Because we've also heard reports of how an entire enterprise functions within the walls of these correctional centres.
Yeah, you're right, and I think you're pointing to the involvement of gangs, which are a massive problem in our prisons. When we at JIX inspected prisons in the Eastern Cape, we had an official tell us that one of these prisons, the gangs were so sophisticated that they had their own systems of courts and police and trials within prisons. So gangs, of course, play an important role, but they wouldn't be able to do much of this without the buy-in of officials, as I've said, who have access in and out of correctional centres.
So how is it then that a problem that has persisted for so many years has still not been addressed in its entirety? Some of us have been around long enough to remember how we met the likes of people like Kenny Gunene and Gayton McKenzie, politicians now, but they too were part of exposing similar things that were going on at a prison in the Free State almost 20 years ago now.
Well, there are a few issues. One of the issues is that prisons in our country in general struggle because of degraded infrastructure and poor maintenance. So we might inspect a prison at JIX and find that these really impressive machines that are meant to scan you on entry to detect contraband just don't work anymore and aren't being properly maintained. We often find problems with the perimeter fences around prisons, which can sometimes be so degraded that officials tell us that members of the community just throw contraband over the fence, and officials or inmates might be able to pick it up there. So there's a problem of austerity, there's a problem of degraded infrastructure, and we know that the department has recently taken steps to try to address that by taking over control of its own infrastructure and maintenance from the Department of Public Works, who were previously responsible. But one other thing I want to say is that to some extent, contraband proliferates in our prisons because of genuine need. And of course, I'm not talking here about weapons or drugs, but you'll see that the startling number of cell phones that are found in cells. Of course, there are inmates who are using those cell phones for illicit reasons, like scamming members of the public. But there are also inmates who have cell phones because a chronic problem in our prison system is that the telephones just don't work. It's honestly very rare for us at JIX to inspect prisons and find that the Telkom telephones that inmates are supposed to use to contact their family actually work. And so where there's a need, a supply will arise.
So just on, let's say, our case study this evening, the Matlala matter, where he is accused of trying to kill his former girlfriend. He's currently being held and has been moved to the maximum security section at Kgosi Mampuru. Given this web, a very large web of access to contraband, does moving him to a maximum security section give any sort of guarantee that he actually won't be able to have a cell phone, if he doesn't have one already, when you consider that this is not a poor man, so even if it cost money, he would be able to pay?
Look, of course, there's always a risk, and the Thabo Bester fiasco at Mangaung taught us that even at prisons that we might consider to be some of the most secure in the country, inmates with money can find a way. That being said, the department does, of course, take serious measures to try to prevent contraband, especially for high-risk and maximum security inmates. And in fact, what we often find is a contributor to effectively preventing smuggling is when a prison isn't overcrowded. Because an overcrowded prison, which has too many inmates and not enough officials, obviously creates security risks and loopholes and allows gangs to proliferate. But maximum securities are generally less likely to be seriously overcrowded. And of course, they're also more likely to take security more seriously. So there's a very high likelihood that conditions there will be much more secure. But
not impossible for someone serving time or being held while awaiting trial in a maximum security section to also be able to get access to a cell phone, drugs, etc.
Of course, I can't say it's impossible, but I think with the publicity we've seen, and I think with the measures the department is taking, that we will hopefully not have any of those occurrences.
Okay, so let's end where we started this evening with that question around the effectiveness then of these raids that are happening by the hundreds, we're hearing, in one calendar year. What do they do in terms of a longer-term sustainable maintenance of law and order in correctional centres?
Look, of course, we understand that searches are part of the department's toolkit and an important part of their toolkit to address contraband. But like I said, they don't address the root causes of contraband and corruption. So you have a search, you get rid of a bunch of cell phones. Generally, within a short period of time, you're going to see more contraband enter that system, unless you plug the holes of entry. And what that would entail would be fixing our infrastructure issues, making sure our perimeter fences, our security equipment is up to scratch, ensuring that there are regular searches of all officials when they enter and leave premises, as well as, of course, of visitors. It would also mean fixing the gaps that cause the need, making sure we have working telephones in our prisons, for example. And the other thing I just want to say before we end is that, of course, the efficacy of these raids and these searches is an important consideration. But at JIX and at the department, another important consideration is the dignity and the safety of inmates. Because at JIX, we often see that when we have these very intense raids or searches conducted in prison cells, there's a high risk of violence against inmates. And we often get complaints, and our investigations validate those complaints, where inmates might suffer serious injury during those searches. And so we're just always trying to ensure that sufficient caution and safeguards are being taken to safeguard, of course, the security of prisons, but also the dignity and safety of the people locked up in them.
Sohela Surajpal, really good to talk to you, legal researcher with the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. Thank you for your time.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.